Have you ever been in a moment when the world looked at you and decided who you were before you even opened your mouth? What would you do if your child was humiliated in front of hundreds of people? Not because of what he did, but because of the color of his skin. This story begins on a quiet morning at a crowded airport in New York. A young black boy, son of one of the most respected CEOs in America, sits proudly in the VIP section beside his father. Moments later, a flight attendant walks up and asks him to give up his seat for a white passenger who deserved it more. Would you stay silent, protect your dignity and your child's heart, or would you stand up and risk losing everything you've built? That choice changed not just one family, but an entire nation. Because sometimes, the calmest voice can shake the loudest system. As you listen, ask yourself, what does dignity mean to you? And if it were your seat, would you still choose kindness over anger? This is not just a story about injustice. It's about legacy, forgiveness, and how one quiet man taught the world what true strength looks like. Stay with me until the end, I promise. It will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because every story like this deserves to be heard. The morning sky in Atlanta was unusually blue. The sunlight fell on the windshield, casting a warm golden glow on the face of Elias Carter, a black man in his 40s, dressed in a neat navy blue suit and matching tie, looking as if he had just stepped out of a business magazine advertisement. But his eyes were kind and deep, without the coldness usually associated with leaders. Next to him, his 17-year-old son, Caleb Carter, sat quietly, holding a small notebook. Caleb was quiet, strangely like his father, calm eyes, low voice, occasionally smiling slightly when the wind blew through the car window. In the front seat, the driver turned his head and asked Mr. Carter, "We will arrive at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in 10 minutes. Elias nodded. "Thank you, David. The weather is beautiful today. Maybe the flight will go smoothly." Caleb looked at his father and smiled lightly. "I always believe in good omens from the weather." Elias gently rubbed his son's shoulder. "When you have experienced enough storms, you will learn to appreciate peaceful mornings like this." The car stopped at the Sky Era Air VIP area. Inside, the lobby was bathed in pure white light, reflecting off the granite floors, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. The receptionists bowed, their eyes on Elias, a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was famous, the CEO of NovaMind Tech, a multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence software company, who had appeared on the cover of Forbes. But today, he was no powerful CEO, just a father taking his son to New York to visit his dream college. "Are you nervous?" Elias asked as they waited for boarding. Caleb smiled and shrugged. "A little, but I don't think Yale will be as scary as that ethics test you give." Elias laughed, his deep, cello-like laugh. "If you can pass that, you can stand anywhere." On the screen, Skyra Flight 2874 showed the words "Boarding now first class." Elias stood up, took his ticket, and let Caleb go first. From the counter, a young flight attendant, Maya Brooks, approached, smiling politely. "Hello, Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. We are very pleased to serve you both." Elias nodded in thanks, his voice soft but firm. "Thank you. I believe the flight will go smoothly." Maya bowed her head, perhaps not expecting that. Just a few hours later, she herself would be caught in a storm bigger than any flight had ever encountered. Inside the first-class cabin, seats 2A and 2B were next to each other, next to the window. Caleb put down his backpack, looked out, and saw the runway shining in the sunlight. "It's so beautiful. Dad, it looks like metal." Elias replied softly, "You know, every time I see the light reflecting on the wings of the plane, I remember the early years of my career, the long flights, the sleepless nights. I promised your mother that one day I would show you the world without worrying about anything." Caleb was silent. He understood the hardships his father had endured, the doubtful looks in meetings, the hidden questions. Are you really qualified? Despite his high position, Elias was still black in a world where skin color sometimes mattered more than qualifications. A middle-aged white woman walked into the cabin, wearing a white coat and expensive sunglasses. Claire Donovan, a well-known financial investor in the banking industry. She looked around, then stopped at seat 2A. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly, her expression displeased. Elias glanced over and nodded politely. Claire responded with a forced smile, then pulled her suitcase back. Caleb leaned over and whispered, "It seems she's not very happy to see you here." Elias smiled lightly. "Don't worry. Sometimes people can't hide their gaze, but that doesn't define who you are." The loudspeaker blared, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Sky Air Flight 274 to New York. Please fasten your seatbelts." That gentle sound seemed to close a peaceful chapter. None of them knew that. In just a few minutes, this flight would become the center of attention for the entire United States, and the lives of all those in first class would never be the same again. The plane shuddered slightly as it slid down the runway, the sound of the engines mingling with the wind whistling through the metal body. Inside the first-class cabin, soft lighting bathed the beige leather seats. The scent of luxury perfume and coffee mingled into a scent that was very characteristic of luxury flights. Caleb tilted his head to look out, seeing the white clouds floating below, like layers of cotton. He sighed softly, his eyes clear. Elias smiled, reading a few pages of financial news on his iPad, occasionally glancing at his son, pride hidden in his deep eyes. About 10 minutes after the plane reached a stable altitude, the sound of heels echoed steadily on the carpet. Claire Donovan walked toward their row of seats. Her white dress and matching jacket made her stand out. Her neck was adorned with sparkling pearls, and she smelled faintly of French perfume. But her eyes carried an undisguised irritation. She looked at the ticket in her hand, then at Caleb, who was sitting in seat 2A, next to the window. She frowned, her cold voice echoing in the quiet space. "I think there's a mistake. Seat 2O is mine." Caleb raised his head slightly, a little confused, and showed the e-ticket on his phone. "Sorry, ma'am. My ticket also says 2A, first class." Claire raised her eyebrows, her eyes flashing with suspicion, then turned to Maya Brooks, the flight attendant who had just arrived. "Please check again for me. I'm Claire Donovan, Platinum member. I always sit in 2A on every New York-Atlanta flight. There's no way I could be wrong." Maya paused, her expression turning confused. She checked the tablet in her hand, her brows furrowing slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Donovan. The system shows that both passengers are assigned to the same position, 2A. Probably a data entry error. I'll check right away." Claire crossed her arms and raised her voice, attracting the attention of several other passengers. "An error. That doesn't make sense. I've been flying Skyer for 8 years, and I've never had anything like this happen." Elias put the newspaper down, his voice soft but firm. "It could be just a small mistake. We're in no hurry. You can rearrange things a little, as long as everything is according to regulations." Maya nodded, trying to keep a smile. "Yes, Mr. Carter, I will take care of it. But Claire didn't let her finish. You're Carter, she drawled, as if the name was vaguely familiar but not worth paying attention to. Sorry, but I paid extra for seat 2A. I have no intention of sitting anywhere else. Caleb looked at his father, then spoke softly. I can change it for her if needed. I don't mind. Elias shook his head. No, I don't need it. It's not my fault. Maya looked at the three of them, feeling the tension in the air. She knew the company had an unspoken rule. Platinum customers get top priority, especially influential people like Claire Donovan. But there was Elias Carter in front of her, a man she had recognized in the paper only yesterday. The CEO famous for his talk about equality in tech companies. She felt like she was caught between two fires. Claire looked straight at Caleb, her eyes cold. Boy, first class isn't for people like you. That statement froze the air. Elias narrowed his eyes, his hands on the armrests, keeping his voice calm. Tell me again. Claire kept her forced smile, but her voice was contemptuous. I mean, he seems so young, and... She hesitated, her eyes glancing quickly at the two of them. Maybe the check-in staff got the class wrong. A few passengers behind her turned to look. Maya swallowed and said softly, Ma'am, please keep your voice down. This is a quiet cabin. Claire turned to her, her gaze sharp. I'm just asking for my seat back. If this airline wants me to continue flying, they should take care of this. Elias took a deep breath. He knew that look, that voice that had followed him through his early years, in meetings where people doubted his ability because of the color of his skin. He wasn't angry, just felt a weariness creeping into his heart. He spoke softly, his voice low but clear. Caleb, hold the chair. I'll go wash my hands. He stood up and walked slowly to the back of the compartment. He saw his reflection in the small bathroom mirror, neat and steady, but there was something quiet and heavy in his eyes. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and told himself, Don't let my son see the anger in my eyes. Outside, Maya was making an internal call to the flight manager. The voice over the intercom was short and cold. If you have a duplicate ticket with a VIP, please move the young man to business class. Do not upset Claire. Maya took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. She turned and saw Caleb still sitting there, staring out at the clouds. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly as she approached. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry. There's a system error. I'm afraid you'll have to move to row 6B. Business. Caleb turned back, his gaze surprisingly calm. Are you sure my ticket says first class? I know, but it's a request from management. Please understand. At that moment, Claire stood up, pulled her suitcase aside, her eyes flashing with victory in her smile. Thank you. I know Sky Air always values loyal customers. Caleb bowed his head slightly, his voice still soft. It's okay. I understand. Maya lowered her head, not daring to look at him. When he stood up, the small suitcase clattered slightly on the floor. A passenger behind her turned around, a look of pity flashing in her eyes. Claire sat down in seat 2A, wiping her hands with a towel, as if she had just finished cleaning up a dirty place. Elias returned just as Caleb was walking down the aisle. He looked around, understanding what had happened. His eyes fell on Claire's face, calm, without a trace of guilt. He said nothing. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder as they switched places, a short gesture that said 1,000 words. The first-class cabin was dead silent. There was only the steady hum of the engines and a heavy feeling that spread like a mist. For a moment, Elias thought perhaps true peace was just the calm before the storm. The atmosphere in the cabin was heavy. The engine's steady hum was like a heartbeat trying to contain its anger, a slow rhythm of metal against the thick clouds. Elias Carter looked out the window. The sky outside was a deep blue. The sunlight seemed swallowed by a blur. He was silent, his hand gently squeezing the magazine in his lap, the pages trembling with each breath. In the front row, Claire Donovan leaned back, eyes closed as if everything was settled. Maya, still standing at the front of the cabin, occasionally glanced down, where Caleb sat alone in row 6B. He kept his face calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her heart feel heavy. Elias bowed his head, trying to focus on the article he couldn't read. From his perspective, his son seemed small in that distant space. He remembered how many times in his life he had bowed his head to invisible prejudices. He had told Caleb that the world was getting better, that technology, education, and kindness could make people see each other for what they truly were. But in this moment, on that comfortable, softly lit plane, he realized not all the doors had opened as he thought. Caleb looked out the window, the white clouds drifting like soft blankets. He thought of his mother, of what she had said before she died. Don't let anger define you. Let your heart guide you. He took a deep breath, then took a notebook from his backpack and wrote a few small notes. Silence is not weakness, but sometimes it is a way to maintain dignity. He smiled slightly, a smile that surprised a nearby passenger, as if the smile belonged not to someone who had just been wronged, but to someone who understood that the world was bigger than petty words. Maya walked along the deck, trying to finish serving drinks. When she got to Caleb, her voice was soft. "Mr. Carter, would you like something to drink?" Caleb looked up, his eyes gentle. "I'll just have a glass of water. Thank you." She nodded slightly, placing the glass on the table. Her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm really sorry. I couldn't do anything else." Caleb shook his head, smiling. "It's okay. I understand. Everyone has their own business." Maya looked at him, feeling her throat tighten. The light shone on his cheeks, the light that made her realize that sometimes strength lies not in power, but in calmness. Elias saw it from afar. He wanted to stand up, but instead sat down. Part of him wanted to protest, to speak up immediately, but the other part, the part that had been hurt in the past, whispered, "Wait, Elias, don't act when your heart is full of anger." He wondered what he was teaching his son if he reacted now, that he should respond immediately when offended, or that he should choose the moment to turn his pain into strength. In the cockpit, Maya received a call from the flight control department. The manager's voice rang through the headset, cold and clear. "Brooks, I just reviewed the first cabin incident. Mrs. Donovan is a platinum customer. Don't let her complain. When you land, write a report that passenger Carter voluntarily changed seats." "Understood." Maya stiffened. Her lips pursed. She replied softly, "But sir, that's not true. I'm not asking if it's true. Brooks, I'm asking if you want to keep your job." The connection was broken. She stared out into space, her heart heavy as stone. The words weighed on her, making every step heavy. She remembered Caleb's gaze calm, yet deep, and felt a pang of shame. In the business cabin, Caleb kept his eyes on the clouds, but sometimes he closed his eyes. He heard footsteps approaching, opened his eyes, and saw a middle-aged woman, friendly-looking, sitting down. "Honey, I saw what happened earlier. I'm sorry no one said anything." Caleb smiled. "Thank you. But it's okay. It must have been a mistake." The woman looked at him, her eyes sad. "No, it wasn't just a mistake. Honey, I've seen this too many times. But you know, the way you kept your cool, it gave me faith that things would be different." When she left, Caleb sat silently, filled with an indescribable feeling. He wasn't angry, just empty. Somewhere above, his father was silent, and he believed he was struggling with the same feeling. Elias closed his eyes. The sound of the engine seemed to fade away. He saw Caleb at age 10, running through the yard in his tattered shoes. He remembered meetings where people looked at him suspiciously, and the rumors that he was favored because of his diversity policy. It all came back to him in that moment, wrapped up in the image of his son being asked to leave his seat. A slight pain in his chest made him open his eyes. He looked around. People were still talking, drinking wine, as if nothing had happened. Maya returned to the first cabin and leaned over to ask Claire if she needed anything else. Claire smiled, her gentle tone now making Maya feel unfamiliar. "Thank you. My coffee is delicious. Sometimes you just need to know where you stand." "Right?" Maya bowed her head slightly, not responding. There was a silent cry in her heart. A little over an hour later, the plane began descending, preparing to land in New York. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. "We'll be landing in 15 minutes. The temperature in New York is 68 degrees Fahrenheit." The voice was steady, calm, as if everything were peaceful. But for Elias, each passing second seemed heavier. He looked at his watch, the minute hand moving slowly. He knew well that sometimes justice does not come from where people expect it, but from the silence of those who witness it. As the plane touched down, the sound of tires hitting the tarmac echoed through the cabin. Claire stood first, grabbing her bag, not looking back. Maya stood at the door, smiling mechanically, bowing to each person leaving the plane. As Caleb passed, she said softly, almost in a whisper, "I won't let this go." Caleb looked at her, nodding slightly. He didn't know what she meant, but in that moment, a small ray of light flashed through the thick clouds. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed down the runway, reflecting off the silver fuselage. Elias walked beside his son, saying nothing. He knew this wasn't over. Something was going to happen. He didn't know what, but deep down, he felt the real storm was just beginning. The New York afternoon was bright, but Elias Carter was gray. He and Caleb left the airport with a chauffeur waiting to meet them. The SUV rolled through the crowded streets, the traffic flowing like an endless stream. Caleb sat still, his eyes down at his notebook, while Elias leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant. Neither spoke for half an hour. Finally, Elias spoke softly, his voice strangely low and calm. "Are you okay, Caleb?" He looked up, his smile thin as a thread. "I'm okay. I think this too will pass. Dad." Elias was silent for a moment, then turned his head to look out the window. "Some things can't just pass, son. They need to be called by their names." They arrived at the hotel in Midtown Manhattan. After checking in, Elias went straight to the balcony. The city stretched out below, its buildings glowing like a steel painting. He pulled out his phone and looked at the message from his assistant, Mr. Carter. "I heard there was an incident on the flight. Do you need me to handle it with the airline?" Elias typed a short message. "Nope, later." Then he locked the screen and put the phone in his pocket. That evening, Caleb went out to get some food. He passed a small park where yellow lights cast a glow on the trees. A young woman stopped her bike in front of him, her eyes familiar. She took off her mask and smiled. "You are on Sky Era 274, right?" Caleb paused. "You are Ava Monroe." She held out a small card. "A freelance journalist? I was on that flight. I saw everything, and I have video." Caleb froze. Ava continued, her voice soft but firm. "I know you don't want to make a scene, but it shouldn't be buried. I filmed the entire thing from Mrs. Donovan's argument to the moment the staff forced you to change seats. You may not believe it, but I saw the look in your father's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a rich man, but the eyes of someone who'd been through this too many times." Caleb looked at her, fear and hope rising in his heart. "What are you going to do with the video?" Ava said without hesitation. "I'll release it, but I want your family's permission. I don't want to make a headline out of anyone's pain." When Caleb told Elias, he was silent for a long time. The room was softly lit by a desk lamp, his face reflected in the window glass. What if everyone knew? Caleb asked. Elias walked slowly over, putting a hand on his shoulder. "If you do what is right, son, you have nothing to fear. But when you come out, remember justice does more than bring light. It also exposes the darkness." Caleb nodded. "Then you decide. I trust you." The next morning, Ava posted the video to her personal page with the caption, "A teenager was asked to leave his first-class seat because he didn't look like a VIP. This wasn't just a mistake. This is the truth we need to see." Within 2 hours, the video had reached 500,000 views. By noon, it had reached 2 million. Comments flooded in. "I can't believe this is still happening in 2025. The boy is amazingly calm. Sky Era must pay the price." Elias didn't answer the phone the entire time. He just sat in his room, watching the news on the screen. The image of Caleb rising from his chair, his gaze calm, was shared all over social media. Public opinion began to split. Some praised his composure. Others asked, was it really a technical error Elias knew well? It was no longer their business. Meanwhile, at Sky Era Air headquarters, CEO Daniel Pierce was in an emergency meeting. A long table was filled with PR advisors, lawyers, and media managers. One of them spoke with a trembling voice. "The video's going viral. Over 10 million views in half a day. We are being called for a boycott." Daniel rested his forehead on his hand and closed his eyes. He had heard of Elias Carter, admired how Nova Mind Tech was leading the way in ethical technology. Now, his own company was becoming a symbol of the opposite. A marketing director suggested we should publicly apologize, say it was the flight attendant's personal fault. Daniel opened his eyes, his voice heavy as stone. "No, if it was a system error, we have to face it. I will contact Mr. Carter myself." That evening, Elias received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a few seconds before answering. Daniel's voice came slowly, a little tired. "Mr. Carter, this is Daniel Pierce, CEO of Sky Era. I want to apologize. I know it's not enough, but I need to start there." Elias remained silent. Daniel continued, "We have temporarily fired the flight crew on 274 while we investigate. I know my company is responsible." Elias let out a soft breath. "Mr. Pierce, I'm not looking for firing. I'm looking for change. But you know, without that video, this would never be mentioned." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Daniel spoke softly. "You're right. Our system is broken from the inside." Meanwhile, Maya Brooks sat in her small Brooklyn apartment. She read the comments about herself, a cutout of her in a video. Her face confused, her eyes filled with fear. One comment stood out. That woman only bows to injustice. She burst into tears. Never in her life had she seen so clearly the price of silence. That night, Elias went out onto the balcony and looked out at the sleeping city. The lights of the distant buildings were like artificial stars. Caleb stepped out and put on his coat. "Do you think people will change?" Elias was silent for a few seconds. "No one changes overnight." "Son, but if a video can make millions stop and think, it's worth more than any excuse." Caleb leaned his head on his father's shoulder. They stood still. In that moment, the night wind blew, carrying with it the sounds of the city, and somewhere, the footsteps of something bigger coming. The next morning, CNN reported Skyra faces crisis of confidence after racist video. Its stock fell 10% in just a few hours. Elias remained silent to the press. But on social media, millions of people were calling him out, praising his restraint and tolerance. Claire Donovan, who had been in seat 2A, watched the video in her luxurious living room. She threw her phone on the chair, her face pale. Her voice was hoarse. "It's just a misunderstanding. It's just a misunderstanding." But deep down, she knew it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. She remembered Elias's gaze, calm to the point of being creepy, and Caleb's gaze, which contained something both kind and embarrassing. For the first time, she felt afraid of herself. Elias received a short message from Maya. "I apologize for not being on the right side. I want to do something." He read it, then typed back, "It's never too late to be on the right side." Maya. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. The first light of day filtered through the curtains, illuminating Elias's face. He closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of heaviness and relief. The story had passed beyond him, but perhaps because of that, it would reach more people than he had thought. The world seemed to explode. Every news story, every tweet, every reaction video mentioned the name Carter. Elias Carter became the new symbol of remarkable restraint in the midst of injustice. But in his 32nd floor hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan, he heard only one sound: silence. That night, New York was bathed in neon lights and the honking of horns from Fifth Avenue. Caleb sat at a small table by the window, a steaming glass of milk in front of him. He rolled up his sleeves and wrote something in an old notebook. Elias walked over, holding a cup of black coffee without sugar, the bitter smell wafting out like the breath of long nights he had lived through. "What are you writing?" Caleb smiled slightly. "Just a few lines for myself. I want to remember this feeling, so that later, when I forget how weak I was, I can read it again." Elias put his hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes a mixture of pride and worry. "Being weak isn't bad, Caleb, but let it teach you to be strong." He sat down across from his son. The air conditioner hummed softly, its warm light reflecting off the brown curtains. Elias looked out at the city, the Empire State Building twinkling nearly 2 miles away. "When I was your age," he said, "I was kicked out of a restaurant for sitting at the wrong table. I didn't say anything, just got up and left. But inside, I promised someday I would sit at any table I wanted. And today, they kicked my son off a chair." Caleb looked at his father. Silent. Elias continued, his voice slowing. "Things change on the surface, but the roots remain the same. We have to find a way to get to the root, not with anger, but with determination. Across town, in the Sky Era Air offices." Daniel Pierce sat in front of a giant screen displaying thousands of comments. He called more than a dozen media advisors, but no one could stop the storm that was brewing. An old clip of Elias Carter's interview on CNN went viral. "I believe that kindness is the most advanced technology that humans have ever created." The line was shared tens of millions of times with the hashtag #PriStandWithElias. Daniel leaned back in his chair and sighed. He thought back to his early years as CEO, when he believed everything could be controlled by rules and contracts. But now, he realized nothing is as powerful as genuine human emotion. Back in the hotel room, Caleb turned on the TV. The screen showed a reporter standing in front of Sky Era headquarters. A crowd of protesters holding signs reading, "Dignity has no color." The reporter's voice was steady. Thousands of people are calling for Sky Era to be held accountable for its discriminatory behavior on Flight 274. To this day, the company has not issued an official statement. Elias looked at the image, his face expressionless, but his heart was in turmoil. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted his son to have a peaceful flight. On the other side of the screen, Maya Brooks sat in her small Brooklyn apartment. She hadn't left home in 2 days. Every ring of the phone made her heart jump. She opened her laptop and read the messages from her coworkers. "Be careful. The company is looking for someone responsible. Rumor has it you were the one who asked the boy to change chairs." Maya closed the phone and took a deep breath. In her mind, she saw Caleb looking at her calmly and whispering, "It's okay." That sentence was like a knife, both light and deep, cutting into her conscience every hour. Late at night, she turned on her phone, opened her email, and typed the first lines of a letter to Sky Era's leadership. "I, Maya Brooks, flight attendant on Flight 274, would like to tell the truth." She wrote until dawn broke, light streaming through the window, shining into her red, swollen eyes. Back in Elias's room, he sat alone. Outside, the city was waking up. The sun shone through the windows, creating long streaks of light across the wooden floor. He turned on the morning news. The announcer's voice boomed. "Skyer has lost more than 15% of its stock value in 24 hours. The company faces a federal investigation if it fails to prove it is in compliance with anti-discrimination laws." Elias closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. He knew that, from this moment on, everything was beyond his control. The phone rang. It was from Ava Monroe. "Do you want to speak to the media? People are waiting to hear your voice." Elias sat in silence. Caleb's voice from last night echoed in his head. If a video can make millions of people stop and think, it was worth it. Elias picked up the phone and typed a few words. "I don't want to talk about anger. I want to talk about how we can look at each other again with respect." Ava simply replied, "That's the message America needs to hear right now." That afternoon, Elias and his son walked out of the hotel. The reporters crowded both sides of the aisle. They asked Mr. Carter, "Are you going to sue Sky Era? Are you going to call for a boycott?" Elias paused, turned, his eyes calm, his voice clear. "I'm not calling for hatred. I'm just asking if your son was forced off his seat because he didn't look like a VIP. What would you do?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. In that moment, Caleb looked at his father, and he understood his father was not speaking to win anyone over, but to remind people of their dignity. The sunlight reflected on their faces, evoking the image of a new generation, a generation that knows how to use calmness to change prejudice. As night fell, the video of the interview was replayed everywhere. In a small coffee shop in Denver, a group of middle-aged people sat watching, some silently, some nodding. In a restaurant in Texas, the white owner hung a small sign on the door. All seats are for everyone. In Chicago, a teacher replayed the video in class, asking his students, "What do you think when you see that boy still smiling and in countless homes across America?" Small but genuine conversations began. In the hotel room, Elias and Caleb sat together again. The television was low, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. Caleb looked at his father. "Dad, I think the world is listening." Elias smiled, his voice deep. "And if they are listening, son, then we don't need to scream." Outside, the city glowed, but in that room, the silence felt like a promise that sometimes silence can make the loudest noise. On Monday morning, sunlight streamed through the window of Ava Monroe's small office. The room was unremarkable. An old wooden desk, a laptop, and a small black camera nestled among a pile of sticky notes. The camera, the size of a palm, now held a secret that could shake America. Ava opened her laptop and looked at the news headline on the screen. "Sky era facing massive backlash, Carter family remains silent." She smiled slightly, but her heart was uneasy. Since the video was posted, Ava has received more than 300 emails a day. Some have called her a hero of justice. Others have accused her of being divisive. She scrolled through them, stopping at one titled, "I'm Maya Brooks." Ava opened it. It was short, just a few lines, but it took her breath away. "I was the flight attendant in the video. I want to tell the whole truth, not to defend myself, but to start over. If you're ready, I'll meet you." Ava closed her eyes, feeling both nervous and sympathetic. She knew this was the moment the story entered a new chapter, one where the truth was no longer black and white. That afternoon, they met at a small cafe in Brooklyn Heights. Maya arrived 10 minutes early. She wore a light jacket, her hair tied back, but her eyes were still tired. When Ava walked in, they looked at each other for a few seconds, as if they both knew this conversation would not be easy. Ava sat down, turned on the recorder, and said softly, "We can start when you're ready." Maya smiled faintly, her eyes drifting to the window. "I used to think that if I just kept quiet, everything would be over. But my silence humiliated a boy. And now, I can't sleep." Ava nodded, her voice light as air. "You can start from the beginning, the way you remember." Maya took a deep breath, then told, from Claire Donovan's complaint about the seat, to the moment she was told by the head flight attendant to take care of it quickly, and the voice in her earpiece clearly said VIP priority. "That boy is just an upgraded economy passenger." Maya's voice caught at that part. "I know it's wrong, but I'm afraid of losing my job. I've seen other staff fired for talking back." Ava fell silent, her fingers lightly touching the recorder. "And when that boy stood up, he looked at me, not blaming, not angry. He just smiled. That smile made me feel cruelly small." The conversation lasted for more than 2 hours. When it was over, Maya stood up and said slowly, "If you're going to post this, please let me know first. I don't want to run away anymore." Ava nodded, her eyes serious. "I promise." That night, Ava sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded only by the sound of a television from a neighbor's house. She played the recording, listening to Maya's every tremor, the pause between sentences. Each sound pulled her back to the flight. She remembered the pale yellow light in the cabin, the sound of suitcase wheels, the click of Claire Donovan's high heels on the floor, and Elias Carter looking around the look of someone who knew too well what it meant to be stripped of dignity. Ava remembered shaking when Caleb stood up, and her hand gripping the camera. She had filmed it, not because she thought it would go viral, but because she feared that if she didn't record it, no one would believe it had really happened. She looked at the camera on the table, a vague sense of dread rising in her heart. She knew that the next video, Maya's narration, could cause a media storm tenfold, but it could also make people understand no one is perfect in a flawed system. She opened her laptop and typed in the title of her new manuscript, Confession of a Flight Attendant. The Other Side of the Sky Era Incident. The next morning, when the article was published, social media exploded again. The video of Maya Brooks's interview reached 5 million views in just 4 hours. Images of Maya crying, saying, "I deserve to be condemned. But I don't want to be part of the silence anymore," went viral. Many were moved. Many were forgiving. But some were angry. One comment stood out. "Thank you for speaking out. Justice is not just judgment. It is also an opportunity for redemption." Elias watched the video in his office at Novamind Tech. He sat silently, looking at Maya's face on the screen. Caleb stood beside her, holding a cup of hot tea. "She's brave," he said. Elias nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. Son, courage is doing the right thing when you're scared. At the same time, Daniel Pierce called an emergency meeting at Sky Era. He placed his hands on the table and said clearly, 'We will be held accountable, not just by apologizing. I want every employee, from flight attendants to directors, to undergo mandatory equality and respect training. And starting today, we will establish a scholarship fund for young people of color who want to pursue a career in aviation.'" The room fell silent. Someone asked quietly, "Are you sure the shareholders will object?" Daniel looked around, his voice firm. "I don't need their approval. I need to look in the mirror and not be ashamed." The news spread quickly. Major news outlets called it the Sky Era reform. Ava looked at the screen and smiled slightly. In that moment, she felt that what she had done was not in vain. But deep down, she was still worried about Maya, who was facing a storm of criticism. That evening, Ava visited Maya. Her small apartment was filled with flowers, thank you notes, and even threats. Maya opened the door, smiling wearily. "You see, the world isn't black and white. Some people forgive me, some hate me, but at least they know I'm real." Ava looked at her eyes full of respect. And real people deserve to be heard. Meanwhile, Elias and Caleb drove out into the countryside, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They stopped at the edge of the woods near a small lake, where the sunset stretched across the water. Caleb watched the sunset, his voice soft. "Dad, maybe I'll study journalism. I want to tell real stories, like Ava." Elias smiled, his eyes warming. "If you tell it from the heart, you can change people, without shouting." On the way back, the radio played the final news of the day, thanks to the courage of a journalist and a flight attendant who dared to speak the truth. Sky Era announces a comprehensive reform campaign. Ava Monroe's video has reached over 40 million views. Caleb laughed. 40 million views. "Dad, our little story is now a national story." Elias replied softly. "It's not about us, son. It's about everyone who has ever been in the wrong seat on a flight of a lifetime." The street lights passed through the glass windows, reflecting on their faces 2 generations, 1 journey, and a story that no longer belonged to anyone. A week after Ava Monroe's video went viral, America seemed to be split in two. One side stood up for Elias and Caleb Carter, calling them symbols of dignity. The other side said the whole thing was blown out of proportion, that it was just a small mistake on the part of the airline. But what silenced both sides for a moment was when the White House officially spoke out. On Monday morning, in a brief press conference, a government spokesman said, "The Sky Era incident is not just about service. It reflects something deeper, how we treat each other in public spaces. This is not a story about one family." Within hours, hashtags like Bosch Respect Takes Flight and Oh, Carter Principle were trending on social media. In the Nova Mind Tech office, Elias Carter was in a meeting with the executive team when his assistant walked in, holding a phone. "Mr. Carter, CNN wants you to speak directly about the incident. They want you to share your insider perspective." Elias looked up and out the window. The city below him was still noisy, but in his eyes, there was a different silence, the silence of someone about to say something important. That afternoon, Elias sat in front of the mirror, tying his tie. Caleb walked in, a glass of water in his hand. "Are you really going to do a TV interview?" Elias nodded slightly. "You've been silent long enough. If you don't speak, someone else will speak for us." He looked at his father, then said softly, "I trust you, but don't let them make you a symbol. They'll want that." Elias smiled, a small, tired smile. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want to be a real voice." As the interview aired, millions watched. The host asked, "Mr. Carter, what do you think really happened on that flight?" Elias looked straight into the camera. What happened was more than a seat swap. It was a small symptom of a larger disease, rationalized indifference. The studio fell silent. He continued, "But I'm not here to criticize. I'm here to say, we can do better. If my son can smile in a moment of disempowerment, then we adults can learn to correct in a moment of power." Across the country, the interview was shared at breakneck speed. Schools, churches, and offices were talking about it. One person commented, "This is not a voice of anger. This is a voice of healing." Another wrote, "I have never seen anyone speak of justice with such gentleness in their eyes." Meanwhile, Ava Monroe was caught up in the media frenzy. Emails, phone calls, and interview requests poured in. An editor from the New York Times asked her to write a feature about the Carter movement. She sat in a cafe, watching people pass by, and chuckled. She had only wanted to tell a fair story, but she had never imagined it would become a movement. But what stuck with her was a text message from Elias last night. "The power isn't in the video, Ava. It's in the viewer's heart when they decide not to look away." Meanwhile, at Sky Era, Daniel Pierce was facing the biggest crisis of his life. The shareholders' meeting was tense. A major shareholder pounded the table. "Daniel, you are turning the company into a political movement. We are an airline, not a human rights organization." Daniel stood up and looked straight at them. "If respect for human beings is politics, then I am ready to be the first to be criticized." Maya Brooks watched the news in her small apartment. She saw Daniel publicly apologize to the entire staff, his voice low and firm. Sky Era is changing, not because of fear of public opinion, but because it is the right thing to do. She smiled slightly, the guilt in her heart fading for the first time in weeks. She texted Ava, "I saw it. Thank you for giving me the courage." Ava replied, "No one gave it to you. You found it yourself." That evening, in a large hall in Washington, D.C., Elias was invited to speak at a conference called Reclaiming Dignity. Hundreds of people were present, many with similar stories. Elias stepped up to the podium, without a paper, without looking at the projection screen. He simply said in a soft, clear voice, "I'm not here to talk about skin color. I'm here to talk about treatment. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been made to feel small, you understand. And if you've ever done that to someone else, you understand. We don't have to choose sides. We just have to choose kindness." Caleb sat at the back of the room, watching his father. He felt something more than anger, a belief that humanity could be better. When the speech ended, the audience stood up. No applause immediately, just deep breaths. Then gradually the applause grew, soft but steady, like rain falling on dry ground. The next day, national television called it America's Moment of Listening, and that's when the second wave really began. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a movement. Other airlines announced plans to review their passenger treatment. A Chicago university announced a Caleb Seat scholarship for disadvantaged students. Ava stood on the balcony of the building where she rented an office, watching people on the street below holding signs reading "Dignity for Everyone." The wind blew gently, and she said softly to herself, "It all started with an empty chair." That night, Elias returned home. In the living room, the lamplight was soft on the wall. Caleb was asleep in the chair, his notebook open on the table. Elias gently placed the blanket over his son, then looked out the window. Outside, the city was still noisy, but he knew that real change was not noisy. It happened in hearts learning to respect each other. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind whistling through the glass. He knew in his heart that this wave was not to destroy, but to cleanse, and perhaps it was from the humility of the small people that America would regain what it had always prided itself on: dignity. The media storm gradually subsided, but in everyone's heart, the waves were still not calm. Elias Carter began to withdraw from interviews, refused invitations to attend prestigious events. He told his assistant, "I don't want to be an icon. I just want to live as a normal father." People thought he was tired, but the truth was that he was beginning to realize that what was important was not the noise outside, but the silence inside. One autumn morning, Elias drove through the Connecticut suburbs. The car passed rows of yellow-leaf trees, the breeze blowing like a greeting from nature. He stopped at a small community center, where today he was meeting with young people of color. They invited him to speak, not as a businessman, but as a man who had been hurt and had learned to stand up. In the simple room, rows of wooden chairs were neatly arranged. Elias stepped forward, without a microphone or camera. He recounted the story of the flight, his voice slow and without anger. When he stopped, a boy stood up and asked Mr. Carter, "If it were me, I would have yelled and argued. How do you stay calm?" Elias smiled. "Calm not because I am stronger, but because I was weaker. When people have been hurt many times, they will understand that anger is just a fire that burns themselves." The room fell silent. In that moment, light shone through the window, illuminating his face, as if the whole world was listening. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Claire Donovan sat in her large living room. The room was as luxurious as ever, but the lighting was different. She looked up at the screen, saw Elias talking to the children, saw the eyes full of trust directed at him. She remembered the moment on the plane, her own voice, arrogant and cold. She turned off the TV, threw the remote aside, and collapsed into the chair. In her heart was the feeling she had avoided all her life shame. The next day, Claire sent a handwritten letter to the Nova Mind Tech office. The letter was long, not flowery, just a few sincere lines. I am the woman in the video. I apologize, not because of public pressure, but because I have recognized the cruelty in myself. If Mr. Carter is willing, I would like to meet and talk directly. Elias received the letter while he was at work. He read it and said nothing for a few minutes. Caleb, who was reading a book, asked, "What are you going to do?" Elias folded the letter and replied slowly, "I will see you, not to forgive, but to show my son that forgiveness is not forgetting, but a way to not let pain take over your life." They met at a small cafe near the Hudson River. Claire arrived first, wearing a gray coat, her hair tied back, her face stripped of the heavy makeup she wore on television. When Elias entered, she stood up. There was no hatred in their gaze, just belated recognition. Claire spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't go back and change that day, but I can learn to be silent differently, silent to listen, not to deny." Elias looked at her, his eyes deep and calm. "We both learned the hard way. What matters is that you don't run away." The conversation lasted only 20 minutes. No tears, no handshakes, just a feeling of relief. When Elias walked out of the cafe, the river breeze blowing on his face, he smiled slightly. He wasn't sure Claire would change completely, but at least today, two people dared to look at each other for real. In Brooklyn, Maya Brooks was working on a new project. After leaving Skyra, she was asked to be an adjunct instructor at an ethics training program for flight attendants. She stepped up to the podium, the light shining in her soft brown eyes. "I used to be the one who didn't dare speak," she said, "because I was afraid. But fear doesn't save anyone. It only makes you lose yourself." Below, the young students listened intently. When the class ended, a girl approached and asked, "Miss Brooks, do you have any regrets?" Maya smiled, her eyes warm. "Yes, but regret is a sign that you still have a heart." Ava Monroe, who documented the entire story, is now one of the most iconic faces of the human media wave. In an interview, she was asked, "What do you think makes this story resonate with millions of people?" Ava looked straight into the camera and said slowly, "Because it's not about someone's mistake, but about how people react when faced with that mistake. In this world, we have a lot of videos that cause outrage, but it's rare for a story to make people want to do better after watching it." The saying spread, becoming a widely shared quote. In schools, teachers used it in ethics lessons. In churches, people recited it as a little prayer for compassion, and in millions of ordinary homes, people repeated the story as a reminder that kindness still has a place. One evening, Elias and Caleb walked along the riverbank. The lights of the bridge reflected on the water, shimmering like silk. Caleb asked, "Father, after all this, do you think it was worth it?" Elias looked out into the distance, where the water flowed gently. "Yes, son, because I believe that from a wound, if you look deeply, light can shine through." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think Ava carries that light too, and Maya too." Elias smiled, his hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "The light doesn't belong to anyone, Caleb. It only passes through those brave enough to open their hearts." The wind blew, carrying the gentle sound of waves. In the sky, the city reflected a soft golden light. Somewhere, there were people still learning to face themselves, but perhaps that was the most beautiful thing, that from the wound, people could find light. A year after Sky Era Flight 274. America was different. There was no more noise, No more heated debates on social media, but in many places, changes were quietly spreading. Airlines applied new training programs. Many nonprofit organizations were established with the name Carter's Principle, the principle of respect and human dignity. But for Elias Carter, those things were just on the surface. He believed that real change did not come from policy, but from the hearts of people when they listened to each other. Early one spring morning, Elias stood by the window of a small house on the shore of a Connecticut lake. The early morning sunlight reflected off the water, creating ripples like shards of glass. Caleb stepped out, holding a cup of hot coffee. "You know," he said, "my school is having a talk show on dignity in a new age. They've invited me to be the youth speaker." Elias turned, smiling proudly. "And what will you say?" Caleb looked out at the lake, his voice soft as if talking to himself. "That calmness is not weakness, that sometimes silence is the loudest way to speak." Elias nodded, his eyes shining with conviction. "It's a lesson that took even you years to understand." Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Maya Brooks was teaching a class of new flight attendants. She walked the aisles, her voice warm and firm. "If you ever find yourself in a difficult situation, choosing between doing the right thing and doing the easy thing, remember doing the right thing can cost you your job, but doing the wrong thing can cost you your life." Below. The students listened attentively, some nodding, others taking notes. At the end of class, Maya walked out into the hallway, where the afternoon sun streamed through the glass doors. She received a text message from Elias. "I heard you were teaching. Proud of you. Maya." She smiled and typed back a short note. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Because of you, I dare to stand up." Ava Monroe, a year after her groundbreaking article, is working on a documentary project called The Seat That Started It All. She and her team traveled across the states, interviewing people who had experienced prejudice, but chose to respond with kindness. During a recording session in Atlanta, she told the camera, "What made me believe in this story was not because it was tragic, but because it was true. It made me understand that sometimes, to change the world, all it takes is one person to decide not to retaliate." After the recording, Ava received a text message from Caleb. "I'm watching the trailer. You told it so well." She replied, "Thank you. Caleb, the world needs young people like you to tell the rest." As for Claire Donovan, after meeting Elias, she chose to leave her former company leadership position and join a charity that supports homeless children. For the past year, she has lived a simple life, away from the media. Whenever she remembers the past, she no longer blames herself, but sees it as a reminder that people can change. One evening, she received a package. Inside was a card from Elias. On the card were just a few words, "Hope you have found peace." Claire smiled, tears falling. She looked up at the pictures of the children she was helping and whispered, "Yes, I am learning to be at peace." On the other side of the country, Daniel Pierce still runs Skyra Air, now a pioneer in fair policies and respect for customers. In a soft but firm voice, he said at a press conference, "We made mistakes, and we learned the most expensive lesson that no amount of profit can come at the expense of respect for people." When the meeting ended, the reporter asked, "Do you still keep in touch with Mr. Carter?" Daniel smiled. "Sometimes. Every time I talk to him, I feel better." On the first anniversary of the event, Ava, Maya, Claire, and Daniel were invited to attend the Voices of Change ceremony in New York. On stage, when the MC read Elias Carter's name, The audience stood up and applauded. Elias stepped out, a golden light illuminating his face, his voice carrying slowly, warm like a breeze. I don't think I deserve to be honored. The person who deserves to be remembered is the 17-year-old boy who smiled when the world turned its back. Because of that smile, I learned that kindness can be stronger than anger. In the audience, Caleb looked at his father, his eyes shining. After the ceremony, Ava walked up to Elias and shook his hand. "You know," she said, "I used to think justice was when someone paid the price. Now I know. Justice is when someone is awakened." Elias replied softly, "And that awakening, Ava, comes from those who tell the truth." Maya walked up too, giving him a hug. "Thank you for believing that people like me can change." Elias looked at them, his eyes full of love. "No one is born perfect, Maya, but everyone can choose to be right when the time comes." When the ceremony ended, the group walked out of the hall. Outside, New York glowed like the Milky Way. The night breeze blew gently through their hair. Caleb walked beside his father and said softly, "Father, I think our story is over." Elias smiled gently, looking up at the starry sky. "No, son. Our story has only just begun in the hearts of people learning to treat each other with respect." On the way home, the radio played a gentle song called "A Seat for Everyone." The melody was soft. The lyrics echoed. An empty seat, an open heart, a world with room for all of us. Elias listened, a smile flickering across his face. He knew that the storm had hurt, but it had also opened a new era where people learned to see each other in light instead of darkness. At night, when everything was quiet, Elias wrote in his notebook, "I don't want to be remembered as a winner. I just want someone else to stand up and say, 'Let them stay.'" He closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, and let the light on the table fade. Outside, the city was still awake, but in his heart, there was absolute peace, the kind of peace that only comes when people forgive and move on together. The weather in New York was unusually clear that day. The sky was pale blue, and the tall buildings reflected the bright light of an early summer afternoon. A long line of people stood in front of Lincoln Hall, holding tickets bearing the words "The Seat That Started It All," a documentary by Ava Monroe. The atmosphere was both excited and solemn, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something that went beyond the confines of a movie. Ava Monroe stood backstage, her hands shaking as she held the microphone. For the past year and a half, she had pursued this project with all her faith and tears. The film not only tells the story of the incident that changed America, but also the journey of people overcoming trauma to find humanity. Behind her, Elias Carter, Caleb, Maya Brooks, Daniel Pierce, and Claire Donovan were all present. They were no longer people of scandal. They were symbols of transformation. Ava turned, looked at everyone, and said softly, "Today, we are not just showing a film. We are showing light." Elias put his hand on her shoulder, smiling. "You did the right thing. Ava, when the lights went out, the auditorium was plunged into darkness. On the screen, the sound of a plane engine was heard, and then an image of a VIP seat appeared. Ava's soft voice spoke. It all started with a chair, but it wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about how people looked at each other. The images flashed Elias being asked to leave his seat, Caleb's calm face looking out the window, Maya's hesitant gaze, and Claire's haughty look. The room fell silent. No one moved. Then the audio cuts to the following scenes: Elias speaking, Maya teaching, Claire volunteering, Daniel holding a press conference, and hundreds of people across the country changing the way they treat each other, another voice is heard. Elias, I used to think justice was something you had to fight for. Now I understand. True justice is when you dare to face yourself without hatred. One particular scene brought tears to the audience. Elias and Claire meet again in the cafe, the light shining through the window, the two sitting across from each other without saying anything, just a slight nod. At the bottom of the screen, the words appear. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's remembering without anger. A choked sob sounded from the back row. Then silence fell. Towards the end of the film, the scene cuts to an interview with Caleb, now more mature, his voice calm and composed. That day, when they asked my father and me to leave our seats, a part of me wanted to fight, but my father said no. He said, sometimes the strongest way to win is to keep your peace. I didn't understand it then. Now I know. He taught me dignity. The final seconds of the film are a slow-motion image, the empty VIP seat in the middle of the plane cabin, the light shining in, then fading. Elias's voice echoes one last time. There are places in life we must leave, but if our hearts are still full of kindness, wherever we are sitting in the right place. When the screen went dark, the theater was silent. No one spoke. No one applauded. Just gasps and wet eyes. Then a clap, soft but firm, a second, a third, and thousands stood. The entire auditorium erupted in the longest standing ovation Lincoln Hall had ever seen. Ava looked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. Elias turned and took her hand. Thank you. Ava, you showed them what I could only hope for. The press called that night, the moment America paused. For 2 minutes after the film ended, no one moved from their seats. They stood, silent, as if the entire country had taken a single breath, a rare moment when people didn't argue, didn't discriminate, just listened. The next morning, the hashtags flooded social media again. But this time it was different. No more anger, no more demands for justice, just genuine sharing. I called my dad after watching the movie. I apologized to a coworker for the way I treated him. I smiled at a stranger on the street. One critic wrote, "This is not a movie about discrimination. This is a movie about people." A week after the premiere, Ava, Elias, and Caleb were invited to the White House. The president greeted them with a warm handshake. America is not defined by what we do wrong, but by how we choose to make it right. He said, and change begins with kindness. Elias replied. They looked out at the front garden, where young people were gathered, chatting and laughing. On the flight back, Elias sat by the window, looking out at the white clouds. Caleb rested his head on his father's shoulder. His eyes closed. "Dad," he said, "I think the world is a little better." Elias smiled. "Not because of the movie, son. Because of the people in the movie. Because of people like you." Ava sat in the back row, laptop open, typing the final lines of the project's concluding essay. The seat that started it all is more than a story. It's a reminder that in every moment our seat is taken away. We can choose to stand up, not to take revenge, but to lead the way. The plane continued to fly through the clouds, sunlight streaming in through the windows. At 30,000 feet, where everything seemed small, Elias closed his eyes and let go. In that moment, America seemed to stop too, not because of pain, but because of awakened compassion. The film's premiere night has passed, but its echoes are still everywhere. Major newspapers have covered it, and millions of emotional posts have flooded social media. But for Elias Carter, when all the applause has died down. He just wants to return to the simplest things, the peace of his Connecticut lake house. Early morning sunlight streams through the windows. Elias sits in his office, a steaming cup of coffee, and in front of him are stacks of handwritten letters from all over the United States. Some people write that they found the courage to apologize after seeing the film. Others say they changed the way they view others. Elias reads each letter, sometimes pausing for a long time on a line, smiling slightly, then carefully folding it. The door opened slightly, and Caleb walked in, camera in hand. "Dad, I want to record a little interview for our school project. The topic is the moment that changed you." Elias laughed. "I thought you were the most interviewed person in America." Caleb laughed along. "But this is different. I asked myself." He put the camera down, pressed the button, and asked, "Dad, what made you truly forgive them?" Elias looked out the window, where the light danced on the lake. "There is no moment, son. Forgiveness is not a one-time decision. It is something you have to do every day when you remember and choose not to hold grudges." Caleb fell silent, his eyes shining in the lens. And in that frame, 2 generations were learning to love differently. In Brooklyn, Maya Brooks was teaching her last training class of the year. After class, a young student came up and said she had been a waitress in a restaurant where people were often discriminated against. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "I saw the movie. I realized I've been silent for too long." Maya looked at her, her eyes kind and deep. "It's okay. What matters is that you spoke up now. Don't let your mistakes scare you. Let them guide you to be better." When the girl left, Maya sat alone, sighing softly, like someone who had just released an old burden. In Atlanta, Ava Monroe was preparing for the film's first public screening. There was no red carpet, no press, just regular people, teachers, workers, students, and others who had been on the backseat of society. When the film ended, no one left right away. A middle-aged white man stood up and said he had been on the flight that year, sitting a few rows from Elias. "I saw it all, but I did nothing," he said, his voice choking. "I lived with that shame for a year. Today I want to apologize, not just to Mr. Carter, but to everyone I hurt." Below, a woman held his hand, tears streaming down her face. Ava watched through the lens, her hands shaking. This, she knew, was why she did this job. Claire Donovan now lives in the Vermont countryside, in a small house in the pine woods. Every morning, she drives to the charity center, teaching children how to write, how to read, and sometimes just how to listen to each other. One afternoon, during class, a little girl asked, "Claire, why do you always teach kindness?" Claire sat down next to her and gently stroked her head. "Because I forgot it, and I don't want anyone to have to learn it like I did." When class was over, she sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset. In her heart, the old wound no longer hurt. It was still there, but now it was just a scar, a reminder, not a haunting. At Sky Era's office, Daniel Pierce stood looking at the new logo hanging on the building. Sky Era, Respect Takes Flight, below. Hundreds of employees gathered for a celebration. He stepped onto the stage, looked at them, and said, "A year ago, we failed a test of humanity. Today, I'm proud to say we're learning that lesson again, every day." People applauded, not because of the rhetoric, but because they believed. Daniel looked out into the distance, where the sky was clear. He thought of Elias and Caleb, the 2 men who had taught him that courage is not about giving orders, but about listening. in Connecticut. The afternoon was slow. Elias sat with Ava and Maya on the porch, the three of them talking about life after the storm. Ava asked, "Mr. Carter, if you could go back to that day, would you do anything differently?" Elias thought for a moment and then said, "No, I would still stand up. But this time, I would hold Caleb's hand tighter. Because when everything is falling, the only thing that keeps you standing is the person beside you." They sat in silence, watching the lake reflect the sunset. Suddenly Caleb stepped out, camera in hand. "Dad," everyone smile. "I want to take a picture after the lights go out." Elias and Ava burst into laughter. As the camera clicked, they had no idea that the photo would be used as the cover for a special article by Ava, titled, "When the Story Ends, the Kindness Begins." The article was widely published, and a year later, it was included in high school textbooks in many states. Students read the story, watched the video, and discussed the respect bench. Many wrote back that they cried, that they understood why calm can be so powerful. That night, Elias sat alone on the porch steps, watching the moon shimmer on the water. He pulled out the old paper, the letter from Claire years ago. He read it again, this time without the heaviness, just gratitude. Caleb walked out and sat next to his father, saying nothing. There was only the wind and the crickets. After all, the world was not more perfect, but perhaps a little kinder. And for Elias Carter, that was enough. Autumn in Connecticut is a soft yellow. Fallen leaves cover the small path leading to the lake. Elias Carter often gets up early, makes himself a cup of hot coffee, then sits on the porch, listening to the wind and the rippling water. Since the release of the seat that started it all, he has received countless invitations, honors, and award nominations, but he has turned most of them down. For him, the most valuable thing is not the praise, but seeing the small things change around him. One morning, Caleb stepped out in his gray sweater. "Dad, I just got a letter from Harvard," he said, his voice barely concealing his joy. "They invited me to be a part of their program, Voices of Dignity, which is about respect and equality in education." Elias smiled, but didn't speak right away. He looked at his son, who had grown up faster than he'd ever imagined. "What would you tell them?" Caleb looked down at the lake and replied, "I would say that dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you keep, even if someone else tries to take it away." Elias nodded, his eyes shining with unspoken pride. In Atlanta, Ava Monroe is finishing her new book, When the World Stood Still. She writes through the night, telling not just Elias's story, but also the story of ordinary people who choose kindness in a fast-paced world. With each page, she recalls the moment of silence at the first screening of the film. "Silence," she writes, "is sometimes the sound of the heart learning to understand." Maya Brooks also began a new journey. She was invited to participate in a national training program for airline employees, with the theme Empathy and Service. At the opening session, she said, "I used to be a quiet person. But then I learned that silence doesn't save anyone. It only makes you lose yourself. I'm not perfect, but I learned that empathy is the most powerful skill in any job." The audience fell silent, then stood up and applauded. At the end of the class, a young flight attendant approached and whispered, "Ms. Brooks, today you learned that sometimes being kind is a form of courage." Maya smiled. "Exactly. And that's what I want you to take with you. In Vermont." Claire Donovan emailed Elias after nearly a year of silence. "Mr. Carter," she wrote, I teach my children every day. They remind me of something I had forgotten, that kindness doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. Thank you for giving me the chance to change." Elias read the letter, smiling slightly. He replied simply, "Thank you. Claire, the world needs more people like you who dare to start over. Daniel Pierce." Meanwhile, has now made Skyer the first airline to have a Respect Above All program. Every year, the airline awards Caleb's Seat scholarships to hospitality students. At that year's ceremony, he invited Elias and Caleb to attend. When Elias stepped onto the stage, he looked at the hundreds of employees, their eyes bright and confident. A company is not defined by its products, but by how it treats others, he said, and today, I see Skyer learned that. The applause in the audience rang out, and it continued. Daniel walked over, shook Elias's hand, and whispered, "Thank you for helping me look back at myself." Elias just smiled. No one helps anyone. We just remind each other of what's right. Caleb sat in the front row, his eyes shining. He understood that his father was more than just a CEO. He understood that he was a sower of change in people. When the ceremony ended, he said to Daniel, "I think my dad would be proud of what he did." Daniel replied, "No, Caleb, I am proud of him." That year, Ava invited Elias to a book signing in New York. A crowd of people showed up. Some had experienced discrimination. Others simply wanted to say, "Thank you." A middle-aged woman approached, holding an old copy of Ava's first article. "I read it last year," she said, "and I decided to apologize to my mother. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. Ava was overcome with emotion, speechless. After the signing, she searched the crowd for Elias. "You see, each of you is carrying this story further than we thought." Elias nodded, his eyes reflecting the calmness of someone who knows the seeds have been planted in the right place. That winter, the ice covered the Connecticut lake. Elias and Caleb walked along the path, the snow falling lightly. "Dad," Caleb said, "if you hadn't taken that flight, would things have been different?" Elias looked up at the gray sky, then slowly said, "Maybe, but maybe God knows that sometimes. To sow seeds, you have to go through storms." Caleb was silent, then smiled. "I think the seeds are sprouting everywhere." A few months later, Caleb's school held its Voices of Dignity speech. Hundreds of students, faculty, and guests showed up. When Caleb's name was announced, he stepped out and stood in the center of the large stage, the spotlight shining down. His voice rang out, deep and steady. "When I was a child, I saw my father being treated unfairly. But he didn't get angry. He chose to stay calm. At the time, I thought he was weak. Now I know that's strength. Dignity isn't about what you say. It's about how you choose to stand up." And if everyone could stay a little calm in the midst of the storm, the world would be a kinder place. The audience fell silent, then stood up and applauded. Elias sat in the front row, silently wiping away tears. That night, father and son sat by the fireplace. Caleb watched the flames dance. "Dad, I think I'm going to write a book tomorrow." Elias smiled gently. "What kind of book?" Caleb replied. "I'm going to write about what you taught me, that kindness never goes out of fashion." Elias gently touched his son's shoulder. "The world will need that book." Caleb, outside. The snow was still falling. In the little house by the lake, the firelight spread warmly across the room, and somewhere, in the classrooms, the flights, the everyday stories, the seeds that Elias and Caleb planted began to sprout, not loudly, not brightly, but strongly and truly. Because in the end, what changes people is not shouting, but repeated gentleness. 4 years have passed since the release of the seat that started it all. The world has changed. America has changed. But what Elias Carter is most proud of is not the plaques bearing his name, but the way young people are beginning to carry his story further than he ever dreamed. One spring morning, Elias walked into a lecture hall at Harvard University, where Caleb was starting his sophomore year. A banner hung on the blackboard reading the Carter Principal Conference Dignity and Dialogue. Hundreds of students gathered, talking passionately about respect, equality, and the role of the younger generation in upholding human values. Elias watched the scene, feeling as if he were seeing himself in his son's image again, but a braver, more confident version. When the conference began, Caleb took the stage. He didn't give a speech. He just spoke in the same sincere, simple voice as his father had. I'm not here to rehash my father's story. I'm here to talk about the future. Every generation has its own storm. It may not be racism, it may be ignorance, it may be prejudice, or the way we've lost empathy in the age of technology. But no matter how the storm changes shape, the way we navigate it remains the same, with respect. The room was silent, except for the light reflected in the eyes of the young people listening. After the talk, a white student came up and shook Caleb's hand. I used to think racism was a thing of the past. Now I see it's still in the way we look at each other every day. Thank you for making me think differently. Caleb smiled. No need to thank me. Just tell someone else. In New York, Ava Monroe has become one of the pioneers of the human media movement. She started an online video channel called Every Voice Matters, where she invites ordinary people to tell their stories. In the special, she invites Caleb to participate. The scene opens with the two sitting across from each other in a dimly lit room. Ava asks, Caleb, do you ever feel pressured by having the last name Carter? Caleb thinks for a moment and replies, yes. But my father taught me that instead of being afraid of someone else's shadow, you should use your own light. I don't want to be a copy of my father. I just want to live up to what he believed. Ava smiles. And that's why his story lives on, because someone is telling it in their own way. The episode quickly went viral on social media. People talked about the Carter generation, a generation raised on empathy, where debates began with listening rather than judging. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks was leading a new training program for other airlines. She stood in the middle of the room, her voice firm but gentle. I've seen how little things make a big difference. Sometimes it's just a look, an apology, or the way you protect someone vulnerable in that moment. A student asked, Ms. O'Brooks, do you think the world will really change? Maya replied, not overnight. But if everyone did just one thing right every day, maybe we would change the world. Her answer was widely quoted, appeared in articles, and became the slogan for the U.S. airline industry's Empathy First program in Vermont. Claire Donovan walked out of the volunteer center holding a small bouquet of flowers from the children. They had just finished their lesson on stories of forgiveness. Claire read aloud to the class a passage by Elias Carter. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the courage to choose love when you could choose anger. When she read that, the children fell silent. Their eyes lit up. Claire, have you ever been forgiven? One boy asked. She looked out the window, where the snow was beginning to melt, and said softly, yes, and it made me want to forgive myself. As for Daniel Pierce, Sky Era is now the airline with the highest reputation for ethics. That year, he held a special press conference to announce the establishment of the Open Seats Foundation to help disadvantaged children have the opportunity to study and travel for free. At the meeting, he said, "One seat changed my life. Now I want those seats to be open to everyone." Hundreds of journalists applauded. One asked, "Are you doing this to apologize or to make an impact?" Daniel replied, "I am doing it because I don't want anyone to learn the lesson I learned, the painful way, in Connecticut." Elias Carter watched the news on a small screen in his living room. He didn't show up much anymore, but whenever someone mentioned the Carter principle, he smiled. That night, he went out onto the porch, where the breeze was cool and the moon was bright. Caleb came home late and sat next to him. "Dad, I've been invited to speak at the International Student Conference in Geneva." Elias looked up, his eyes shining softly in the moonlight. "Geneva, it's far away." Caleb smiled. "It's far away, but I think I should go, not to tell your story, but to say that kindness has no boundaries." Elias nodded. "I think you're right. The world needs people who take kindness further than you did." A week later, Caleb stood on stage in Geneva. The hall was huge, and the audience was from all over the world. He told his story, no rhetoric, no pathos, just the truth told from the heart. When my father was asked to leave his seat, he didn't react. He didn't get angry. He just smiled and said, "Son, we'll be fine." When I asked him why, he said, "Because our dignity doesn't depend on where we sit, but how we stand up." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Back in America, Caleb met Ava for an interview. She asked, "What do you think made your father so respected?" Caleb chuckled, because he never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to be a good person. Ava looked at him, her voice gentle. "And now, your generation is doing that." That night, Elias received a video call from his son. Caleb smiled. "Dad, I think I understand. Dignity is not your legacy, but your gift to everyone." Elias smiled, his eyes as kind and warm as they had been all those years ago. "I know, son. And I'm proud that you said it in your own words." The wind blew gently through the porch. The leaves fluttered. Somewhere, in every little story of the American people, the seed of humanity that Elias Carter planted that day continued to sprout. It was no longer a movement, no longer a story in the newspaper, but a habit, the way people treated each other with respect. And perhaps that was what Elias wanted most, that when the new generation spoke, the world would listen not with their ears, but with their hearts. One winter morning in Connecticut, Elias Carter sat in his office, staring out the frosted window. Everything was peaceful, until the phone rang. On the other end was Ava Monroe, her voice low but a little confused. "Elias, I just got an email. Someone wants to see you. It's Henry Dalton." Elias was stunned. Henry Dalton, the name had lain dormant in his memory for years. Henry was the white passenger who had asked the airline staff to change Caleb's seat that year. Ava continued, "He's in the hospital in Boston. He wants to see you. He says he has something to tell you before it's too late." Elias was silent for a long time, then simply said, "Ava, help me arrange it." He hung up and sat there for a long time. The past, which he thought had closed, suddenly came back, knocking lightly on the door, but enough to make his heart waver. That afternoon, Elias spoke to Caleb. "I think you're going to Boston." Caleb looked at him, his eyes slightly frozen. "Are you sure? After all these years? Is he worth it?" Elias smiled gently. "Sometimes, son. Forgiveness isn't about the other person's merit, but about your own peace of mind." Caleb fell silent, His head bowed. "I'll go with you." Elias nodded, his eyes softening. The next day, they arrived at Boston Memorial Hospital. The hallway was long and smelled of antiseptic. Elias walked slowly, clutching an old wooden cane. When the door opened, Henry Dalton lay there, his hair white and his face deeply wrinkled by time. When he saw Elias, he struggled to stand up, his voice weak but clear. "I didn't think you'd come," Elias replied softly. "I didn't think I would either. But I'm here." At that moment, the room fell silent. Only the beeping of the heart monitor could be heard. Henry took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "I carried that shame for years. When I saw the film about you, I couldn't bear it. I realized in that moment that I had taken more than just a chair. I had taken something bigger, a child's belief that the world was fair." His voice trembled. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just don't want to leave with that in my heart." Elias stood still, his eyes fixed on Henry. Not angry, not blaming. He simply said, "You know, Henry, I didn't hate you that day. I was just sad that you hadn't learned what we're all born knowing, that respect doesn't require asking permission." Henry bowed his head, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I taught my son that I was always right, and that's what drove him away from me. Now I understand. I was wrong." Elias sat down beside the bed, placing his hand on Henry's shoulder. "No one is too late to learn. Henry, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it gives you a different way to look at it." Caleb stood in the doorway, silently watching the scene. He was filled with mixed emotions, anger, pity, and finally a relief that was hard to name. As the two men held hands, he understood that there were battles that didn't need to be won, just stopped at the right time. A few weeks later, Henry Dalton died. Inside the envelope sent to the Carters was a handwritten letter. "Mr. Carter, thank you for giving me the peace I don't deserve. I am leaving a small donation to the Carter Foundation, hoping it will help children sit where they belong." Elias read the letter, his eyes distant, both sad and peaceful. He folded it carefully and placed it on the altar next to his father's photo. That evening, Elias and Caleb sat on the porch. The night sky was sparkling, the moonlight shining on the lake. Caleb said, "Father, I think I understand. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without pain." Elias nodded slightly. "Yes, son. And when you are no longer bound by pain, you are free." The next day, Ava came to visit. She brought a camera and said, "Elias, I want to record this conversation. Not for television, but for posterity." Elias agreed. The scene opened with him sitting by the window, his voice deep and warm, each word as light as the wind. "People ask me if forgiveness makes me feel lighter. I say yes, but not because I am a good person. It is because I have learned that hatred does not make you strong. It only makes you smaller. I cannot change the past, but I can choose to move on from it." Ava was silent, just letting the camera capture that moment, an ordinary man. But shining within him was the light of truth and kindness. When the recording ended, Ava whispered, "You know, Elias, I think the world needs to hear this again." He smiled. "Let Caleb's generation continue. They know how to speak in a language young people understand." Ava nodded, her eyes welling up. A few weeks later, Caleb edited the video and posted it on the Voices of Dignity channel. No advertising, no gimmicks, just an 8-minute clip. But it went viral faster than anything before it. Millions shared it, not out of curiosity, but because they felt touched. a comment pinned to the top. When one person forgives, the whole world learns to love. That night, Elias watched the video with Caleb. He looked at himself on the screen, then at his son. "I think that's enough." "Son, I've said what I needed to say," Caleb replied. "No, Dad, I've only planted the seed. The rest is up to us." Outside, the wind carried the chill of late winter, but in that small house, there was something warm, enduring, and brighter than the light. Perhaps it was serenity, the only worthy reward for those who know how to forgive. Spring arrived earlier than usual in Connecticut that year. The trees along the lake were budding, reflecting on the mirror-like surface of the water. In the small house on the shore, Elias Carter sat by the window, a cup of hot tea in his hand, his eyes staring into the distance. He had just watched the video Caleb had posted a few months earlier, the 8-minute clip that had silenced the entire country. The comments on the video were still rising by the hour. Millions of people were resharing it. Hundreds of schools were incorporating it into their curriculum as an example of tolerance and humanity. But to Elias, all of it was just a distant echo. He smiled and said quietly to himself, "If one person understands, that's enough." That afternoon, Ava Monroe drove up to visit. She brought a copy of her new book, The Carter Legacy. She set it on the table, the cover showing Elias and Caleb sitting on the porch, bathed in the light of sunset. "I want you to have the first copy," she said. Elias picked it up and turned the pages, his voice deep and warm. "Ava, you write from the heart. I can see that." Ava smiled, her eyes sparkling. "Thanks to you, Elias. You made people believe that calm can be stronger than anger." Elias looked out the window, where the sun was setting slowly. "Actually, I only learned to be quiet when the world was too loud. And sometimes, in silence, people can really hear each other." That evening, Caleb came home with letters from all over. "Dad, I think you should read this," he said, handing over a thick envelope. Elias opened it, revealing elementary school drawings. One showed him standing next to a chair with the words "Respect is a seat for everyone." Elias laughed, his eyes slightly moist. "I didn't expect to be an art lesson," he joked. Caleb laughed along, but it was the best lesson I've ever seen. The next day, Skyra held a ceremony to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Open Seats Foundation. Daniel Pierce invited Elias to attend, but he declined, leaving only his greetings and a short video. "In the video," Elias said, "I can't come, but I want to say that every seat you hold today is a symbol of respect. Let's make sure no one is forced out of their seat again, whether on a plane or in life." When the video played, the entire audience stood up and applauded. Daniel looked up at the screen, his eyes red. In Vermont, Claire Donovan was teaching in a small classroom. On the board, she wrote, "Kindness is not weakness." A student asked Miss Claire, "Do you know Mr. Carter?" Claire smiled slightly. "I met him, and he taught me that sometimes the most powerful way to change the world is to forgive." She looked out the window, where cherry blossoms gently fell, her heart as light as if she had never been wounded. A week later, Elias felt his health fading. He said to Caleb, "Son, I'm tired, but I feel at peace. Don't worry." Caleb squeezed his father's hand, his voice choked. "Dad, you've done too much. Now you can rest." Elias smiled. "Do you know what the greatest thing in my life is? Not success, not fame, but seeing you become the man I hoped you would be." Caleb bowed his head, tears falling, but there was deep pride in his eyes. That night, The sky was calm. The wind blew gently through the window. Elias lay in the armchair by the window, looking up at the stars. In a hazy dream, he saw himself on that flight again. But this time, no one stood up. No one was evicted. Everyone smiled, talked, shared cookies and coffee. Little Caleb then turned around and smiled at him. "Dad, we're okay." Elias smiled back. "Yes, son, we're okay." The next morning, Caleb found his father dead in his sleep, his face peaceful, still holding the photo of them by the lake. The funeral was simple, attended only by family, close friends, and those who had accompanied him on his long journey. Ava read the eulogy. Her voice choking Elias Carter taught us more than equality. He taught us that kindness is a light that shines when the world is darkest. After the ceremony, Caleb sat by the lake where his father had liked to sit. Ava came up beside him and put her hand on his shoulder. "You know, Caleb, his light never goes out. It just changes places with people like you." Caleb was silent, watching the water reflect the setting sun. "I will continue to tell your story," he said, "but not to glorify him, but to remind people that anyone can be their own Elias Carter." A year later, Caleb officially founded the Carter Institute for Humanities and Education in Boston, which trains young people in empathy, communication, and cross-cultural understanding. Ava, Maya, Claire, and Daniel were all present at the inauguration. They looked at the plaque engraved with the words, "Dignity is not given, it's chosen." They all smiled, knowing that Elias' legacy lies not in books or movies, but in the hearts of those who listen and love. When the ceremony ended, Caleb stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the bright sky. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of new grass and the sound of birds flying across the lake. In that moment, he heard what sounded like his father's voice, deep and familiar. "Son, if only one person listened, the world would change." Caleb smiled slightly, looking up at the sunlight filtering through the trees. The light fell on his shoulders, warm and steady as if Elias Carter were still there, in every breath of the earth and sky, in every story people told, and in the hearts that chose kindness over anger. And so, the story ended, not with applause, but with the silence of a world that had learned to love a little more, just enough to make life worth living. Elias Carter's story is not only a journey of a black father facing discrimination, but also a reminder that dignity is not in where we sit, but in how we stand, in a noisy world. Sometimes true strength comes not from protest, but from calm and tolerance. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but choosing not to let the past bind your heart. Elias teaches us that kindness never goes out of style. Every small act of kindness is a seed that can change the world. You may not be a CEO or have thousands of followers, but you can be the one to make a child believe that the world is fair. For older audiences, this story is also a gentle consolation. No matter how many wounds life leaves behind, we can still choose to walk in peace, because in the end, what makes us remembered is not our success, but the kindness we leave in others. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If Elias Carter's journey touches your heart, please take a second to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more humane, emotional, and meaningful stories like this. Because sometimes, just one story, one moment, can make the world a better place starting with you.